You have to have visionaries, you know, you have to have people that will think outside of the norm.
We have to be given the power to tell our own stories.
We all want to say our piece. This is a crazy time.
What they care about is what it means to them.
You have to not think like society thinks.
This is a fight about power. Who has it and who has the right to use it?
We're having a reckoning about what public safety can, should, and must look like.
It's about a broader question of representation and who gets to create the images and define how we see the world.
They want their voice to be heard, they have to get involved.
Finally, we get to tell our truth and tell our stories like our stories matter.
What's going to bring people together is equality.
The love that we have for each other is the shortcut to true human happiness.
You start to see how it's all connected.
Every single person around the world can create a movement.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Candace Montgomery, the Senior Vice President and General Manager at Atlantic Live. Welcome to our 7th and final day of this year's Atlantic Festival. We are so glad you are all here with us. We hope you've enjoyed what you've seen so far, and maybe you even had some opportunities to meet some new people. Once again, we want to thank our underwriters who have made the Atlantic Festival possible this year. They are Facebook, our founding level underwriter, Boston Consulting Group, EY, Genentech, Southern Company, and Walton Family Foundation, our presenting level underwriters. Allstate and U.S. Bank as supporting level underwriters, American Federation of Teachers, Barclays, the Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson, the MacArthur Foundation, PayPal, Salesforce.org, and Truth Initiative as contributing level underwriters. Our exclusive media partner is NBC News. To learn more about what we have in store today, you can visit the agenda within the event platform. There, you'll find information on the final edition of our Idea Stage, beginning at 2 p.m. Eastern. You won't want to miss it. Now, let's get started.
For a conversation about the new PBS documentary, Muhammad Ali, please welcome actress and Ali's daughter, Rasheda Ali, and filmmaker Ken Burns. Alison Stewart, the host of All of It on WNYC, is here to lead the conversation.
Today, people throw around the word icon when it really only belongs to a very few. Muhammad Ali is one of those few. He was an internationally recognized figure, 3-time heavyweight champion, a civil rights leader, a man with fierce beliefs about race, religion, and his own beauty. Documentary filmmaker Ken Burns has made a 4-part docuseries for PBS about the life of Muhammad Ali. Let's take a look at some footage from the documentary. Want to let you know the champ drops the N-word twice in this footage. So yes, there is strong language that some may find a little bit offensive, but it is all part of the story. Let's look.
You want some breakfast?
I want some cornflakes.
Can I have some of your cornflakes? Oh, I don't want none. I won't take none. I won't take none. I won't eat none if you don't want me to. Ooh, look at that pretty horse there. Is that a white horse? See? Now stand up. Look over there. Stand up. You got to stand up over that building. See the big one? There he is.
My earliest memories that I can think of as a child with my father are walking through airports and being in crowds and feeling in the vibrations of people's clapping and shouts in my chest. And just looking at my dad, you know, like, who is this person? And it was all the time, anywhere we went. You're the greatest, we love you, and the clapping, and Muhammad. I loved feeling all the energy and the love that he felt.
We now think of Muhammad Ali as this vulnerable guy lighting the torch in Atlanta, and everybody on the globe loves him. Black people like him, white people. He's a universal hero, like almost in a religious way, like the Buddha. But when he was in the midst of his career, and not just in the early bit, he was incredibly divisive.
Boo, yell, scream, throw peanuts, but whatever you do, pay to get in.
People hated him, whether it was along racial lines, class lines, Vietnam lines, political lines, religious lines, where they just couldn't stand him. And people, of course, had the opposite, and this was, I loved him. Loved him. But you had an opinion about him.
I ain't scared of nobody. It's gonna take a good man to whoop me. You can look at me, I'm loaded with confidence. I can't beat me. I had 180 hours to fight, 22 sacrifice, and I'm good as a girl. Look how pretty I am. My long trimmed legs and my beautiful arms and my pretty nose and mouth. I know I'm a pretty man. I know I'm pretty. You don't have to tell me I'm pretty. I'm cocky, I'm proud. You never talk about who's gonna stop me. Well, ain't nobody gonna stop me. I say what I wanna say. Ain't no more big niggas talking like this.
He was a pioneer, he was a revolutionary, he was a groundbreaker, a guy known simply as the greatest.
I am the greatest.
I've wrestled with alligators. I've tussled with a whale. I done handcuffed lightning and put thunder in jail. You know I'm bad. I can drown a drink of water and kill a dead tree.
This will be no contest.
Wait till you see Muhammad Ali.
To have that chutzpah and to be a black man in America it was outlandish.
Muhammad means worthy of all praises, and Ali means most high.
And I just don't think I should go 10,000 miles in here and shoot some black people that never called me nigger. I just can't shoot it.
I always wonder why Miss America was always white. Santa Claus was white. White swan soap, king white soap, white cloud tissue paper, and everything bad was black. Black cat was the bad luck, and if I threaten you, I'm gonna blackmail you. So Mama wanted to call it white male. They lied too.
I love being around him. I love being around Muhammad Ali.
You gonna float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ah, rumble, young man, rumble. Ah!
The price of freedom comes high. I have paid, but I am free.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom, cut me loose. The winner and still heavyweight champion of the world. And the greatest fight of all time.
I'ma keep on running, cause the winner don't quit on themselves.
He called himself the greatest, and then proved it to the entire world. He was a master at what is called the sweet science, the brutal and sometimes beautiful art of boxing. Heavyweight champion at just 22 years old, he wrote his own rules, in the ring and in his life, infuriating his critics, baffling his opponents, and riveting millions of fans. At the height of the civil rights movement, he joined a separatist religious sect whose leader would, for a time, dominate both his personal life and his boxing career. He spoke his mind and stood on principle even when it cost him his livelihood. He redefined black manhood, yet belittled his greatest rival using the racist language of the Jim Crow South in which he had been raised. Banished for his beliefs, he returned to boxing an underdog, reclaimed his title twice, and became the most famous man on earth. He craved adulation his whole life, seeking crowds on street corners, in hotel lobbies, on airport tarmacs, everywhere he went, and reveled in the uninhibited joy he brought each adoring fan. He earned a massive fortune, spent it freely, and gave generously to family, friends, even strangers, anyone in need. Service to others, he often said, is the rent you pay for your room here on earth. Even after his body began to betray him, and his brain had absorbed too many blows, he fought on, unable to go without the attention and drama that accompanied each bout. Later, slowed and silenced by a cruel and crippling disease, he found refuge in his faith, becoming a symbol of peace and hope on every continent. Muhammad Ali was, the novelist Norman Mailer wrote, the very spirit of the 20th century.
I'm always gonna be one black one who got big on your white televisions, on your white newspapers, on your satellites, $1 million checks, and still look you in your face and tell you the truth and 100% stay with and represent my people and not leave them and sell them out because I'm rich and stay with them. That was my purpose. I'm here and I'm showing the world that you can be here and still free and stay yourself and get respect from the world.
Joining us now is filmmaker Ken Burns. Hi, Ken.
Hi, Alison. Good to see you.
Good to see you again. And also joining us is Rasheda Ali, Muhammad Ali's daughter. Nice to meet you, Rasheda.
Nice to meet you, too. Thanks for having me.
So watching this series, we get a sense of Ali, the athlete, Ali, the cultural figure, but also Ali, the human being, the man. So let's start at the beginning, Ken. Born in 1942, growing up in Louisville, segregated Jim Crow South. What is something about growing up in this era that became a through line in Muhammad Ali's life?
Well, it's interesting. It's a combination of both protection and vulnerability. Obviously, for African Americans, being in the Jim Crow segregated South has its dangers. He's not too much younger than Emmett Till when Emmett Till is brutally murdered and his mother has the courage to leave an open casket. His father was a painter but never got any respect, had to become a sign painter. He lived in a comfortable middle-class black neighborhood in the West End. And so there's a kind of push-me-pull-you experience. When he wins the gold medal, the city fathers of this same segregated Louisville sort of put their arm around him and start a sponsorship group that protects him from the mob and the associations that come with that. So it is a particularly interesting and complicated and at sometimes contradictory brew that he's grown up in. But at the same time, he's exhibiting something very, very early on, which is just a sense of purpose, a sense of humor, a sense of wanting to please people, a sense of promotion. I mean, he's barely put on boxing gloves. He can't do anything, and he promises people he's going to be the greatest and then makes good on that promise. There's something utterly sui generis about him, just as at the same time, this film is attempting to place him in the context of the age which produced him and the way in which he, you use the word icon, influenced that age almost the way no one else has.
Rasheda, we learn as a young man how he comes to boxing. There's a stolen bike involved. He winds up at a boxing gym and a gentleman says, well, maybe you should learn to fight so you can beat up the kid who stole your bike. That is one of those moments, a decision you make, right? If he hadn't decided to go there that day, if he hadn't decided to plug into this, what was it in those early days that your dad was getting out of boxing?
You know, first, thanks for having me on the show. I was watching this documentary story and I'd seen so much really incredible footage that I'd never seen before. And one of the clips that I saw watching the documentary was, you know, some fight my dad had just completed, and he had just converted to Islam, and he had reporters surrounding him, as he always did. And, you know, they asked him, hey, Cassius, what, you know, some were still calling him Cassius Clay, and some were saying Muhammad, and they said, you know, what do you plan on doing next with your life? And he says, I don't really care about boxing that much. You know, one of the reporters, what do you want? And he says, I want what all African Americans want. I want freedom. And he says, I don't know what my purpose is, but God's gotten me here for a reason. Right. And when I saw that clip, I got chills, because that's who my dad was. He always felt that everything in his life from childhood had a purpose. Even when he was 12 years old and he was starting to box and he fell in love with boxing, and he wanted to do something with his life. He told his brother Rudy, Uncle Rahman, if I were ever to become famous, I'm going to help my people. So my dad was very transcendental in his thinking. He was always thinking one step ahead of all of us even. So to watch my dad unfold on film and the way, and I thank you, Ken, for being able to tell his story so beautifully. It really captured the essence of who he really truly was. And he was passionate about whatever he did in his life, he was going to help his people. And that's what he did.
You know, in watching the film, you get that sense of life is about a series of decisions you make. Ken, what's an example of a choice that Muhammad Ali made early on in life, pre-fame, that really changed the trajectory of his life?
Well, I think it's the one you mentioned. It's that accident of the stolen bike and deciding to going down into the basement looking for a cop to complain, to find the person who did it, stole his and Rudy's red Schwinn bicycle, a prized possession, as you can imagine, and finds a cop, Joe Martin, in the basement teaching not only white but black kids how to box, and some light goes off. And then he's really almost everything from then is plowing on from that decision. He also buys a record early on called The Black Man's Hell is the White Man's Heaven, or The White Man's Heaven is the Black Man's Hell. And it's read by a minister X, Louis X, who is Louis Farrakhan, a member of this separatist religious cult called the Nation of Islam. And it really had a big impression on him and gave him a kind of foundation of a worldview that permitted him to enter into his late teenage years, his professional life, all that was going to come with a little bit more philosophical, spiritual underpinning. And I think that's one of the really great decisions. Sarah Burns and David McMahon, who are the co-directors of this film with me, we were interested in all of those signal moments, not just the kind of biographical signposts, but those internalized things. And I think too often when we refer to somebody, particularly an icon, there's an opacity just by virtue of bestowing them with the notion of icon. One of the things I did was move from a very comfortable and perfect position in episode 3, that cornflakes, stealing the cornflakes from Rashida's older sister Miriam, which is just to try to tell you, you may think he's a superhero, and he is. You may think he's a god and an icon, and he is. But he's also a human being. There's not a parent on the planet who hasn't stolen French fries or cornflakes from their kid. And it's followed by Rashida's half-sister, Hannah, who speaks about the vibrations in her chest. And so we wanted to contextualize that iconography, larger than life, bigger than life, but say, look, we will attempt to make it intimate and personal and accessible. And throughout the film, Rashida and Hannah do just that, as do a lot of other people. Sometimes they're poets. Sometimes they're cub reporters who are now grown into old, distinguished gentlemen like Robert Lipsyte and Dave Kindred and Jerry Eisenberg, the best in their business. Sometimes they're scholars like Gerald Early and Todd Boyd and Sherman Jackson. Sometimes they're writers and biographers like David Remnick, who you saw, or Jonathan Eig, his most recent biographer. Sometimes they're hangers-on, folks from the neighborhood. All of them help paint a picture of not just this larger-than-life icon, but this real human being. And that, for Sarah and Dave and me, was the most important accomplishment we did. We had to, in order to put him in the spectacular relief he deserves. He died the most beloved person on the planet. You have to also make him human and also reveal his flaws. And I think Rashida would say, you know, at times it's difficult to watch. She went through with her mom a painful divorce. It's written all over her mom's face, who was kind enough to give us that. And yet they kept a love for him. And being a kid and separated by divorce is no picnic. And Rashida is able to represent that and at the same time understand in a larger sense what this man was about, what his mission was. And as she says so poignantly near the end of the film, boxing was just this much, you know, meaning it could have been another accident. Maybe he'd become a simple carpenter.
Rashida, I don't want you to tell me about Muhammad Ali right now. I want you to tell me about your dad. Describe your dad to me.
Daddy was a beautiful man. He, unfortunately, when my parents divorced, we were 5 years old around that age. And we were living in Chicago with my grandparents. So we were, in a sense, separated from our dad. And I remember just being in this strange environment saying, you know, why am I here? And I didn't understand it at that time, but as the years went on and we were just, Daddy would call us, he stayed in contact with us, and we would go visit him occasionally. It just felt really bizarre to be outside of his presence, because that was the only thing that was really comforting me as a child. And so the times that we did spend with our dad, because we shared him, and I knew that at a very young age that we had to share him with the world, because he belonged to everyone. He was everyone's father. He was everyone's brother. He was everyone's, confidant and friend. Once I realized that we had to share him, I really didn't want to. I just wanted to be in his presence. And the times that I spent with him when he would visit, or we would go to California where he lived, I knew it was like gold to be able to spend that time, because every single time that we spent together was magical, meaning he was either informing us, or he was giving us his love. He was showing us direction from example. He lived by example. So he showed us what a humanitarian looked like at a very young age. So we knew at a young age, he was very generous with his time. He was very generous with his money. We didn't understand it, but he taught us at a young age. He was very compassionate and loving. So the times, he was playful too, and he would play magic tricks, and he would play piano horribly, by the way. But then he was a horrible singer, but he was one of those dads where he was the cool dad. You know what I mean? And Daddy was more like, to me, I think he was more like an older brother, where, as I got older and I was fortunate enough to spend way more time with him because it was after college, my dad would give me life lessons and advice, but it would be like an older brother's kind of giving me advice. And I would tell my dad private things that I couldn't tell my sister. So he was the cool dad, but he was a dad that I wanted all to myself because of his love and generosity. And because we were taken from him at a young age, I cherished those times together.
Ken, in the film, we get the sense that Muhammad Ali created narratives around himself, narratives around his fights, narratives around his opponents. When was a time, some of it was theater, when was a time when the narrative got away from him a little bit, and it went past just being for show, past sort of creating an image?
Well, you've described it very, very well, Allison, and it's really true. And there's one, I think, very, very important moment where that really takes place. Of course, it's impossible. The greatest showman can't control everything, but he does design the stories. He designs the narratives. Unfortunately, in many cases, particularly with his greatest rival, Joe Frazier, he used the language of a white racist, describing a black man to describe his black opponent. And it was very unfortunate. As the scholar Todd Boyd said, here is this, the most conscious black man, and he's using this reprehensible language. It's driving Joe Frazier crazy and angry, and he never forgave him. And it was his attempt to sort of paint the larger picture of what the dynamic of the story was, and not really following it through. And as Boyd says, I think in this case, he used his powers for evil instead of good. And once again, you're back to the superhero aspect of it. I would say that it happened in several fights, most pronounced with Joe Frazier, but it's an instant in which he created a narrative that escaped him, and he understood it. By the end of his life, not even the end of his life, in his last several decades of his life, he continued important work on himself. Rasheda is the clear and obvious beneficiary of that love and that sort of self-work. But he went to address all of these things that he saw: the unfaithfulness to wives, the turning his back on Malcolm X before Malcolm X was murdered by members of the Nation of Islam, and I think the Joe Frazier incident. Joe never forgave him. It really cut to the quick. But I know that Muhammad sincerely regretted that and realized, as you said, I think very, very smartly, and that the narrative got away from him in that case.
One of the radical things about Muhammad Ali, Rasheda, was the cockiness and the self-assuredness and the describing himself as pretty. It's a way that African Americans were not taught to think about themselves at this time. Why was that so important? His cockiness, his self-assuredness.
my dad, and you watch, that he saw the Gorgeous George, the wrestler, and he saw that Gorgeous George had silver hair and he had his flamboyant cape, and he was talking about how incredible he was, and he would brush his hair before a bout. And my dad was like, wow, he was intrigued by Gorgeous George's confidence. And he thought he would sell tickets for the fights because, at the time my dad was boxing, a lot of people didn't really, they had a small market of men that watched it, it really didn't go outside of that small target market. And my dad really wanted to sell tickets and really bring boxing to the mainstream. And he did that. And so when he saw the Gorgeous George and his flamboyance and his cockiness, he's like, wow, that's a great idea. And when he brought that energy to his aura or his personality trait on camera, people loved it. And I think it meant more than just selling tickets. It became about, I can be Black, I can be beautiful, and I can tell people I'm Black and beautiful, and I can love myself, and I can have confidence, and I can do whatever I want. And Daddy's bringing to the world, to Black and brown people, who at that point was, of course, obviously, racism was a huge part of our lives as African Americans. And we were hugely oppressed, and we were disrespected. And my dad was the first to tell African Americans that you can be Black and you can be beautiful and you can be proud and you can have confidence and you can do whatever you want. And I think deep down, the African American community was like, for the first time in my life, I feel that anything is possible. And for the first time in my life, I feel that I really am beautiful. And so for the first time, a lot of African American and Black and brown people were finally loving themselves. And that was the power that my dad gave them, almost indirectly, because I think at first it was kind of like, hey, let me sell tickets. And then it kind of became one of those things where his superpower was making African Americans and oppressed people feel good about themselves. And that was powerful back then.
Ken, when did his political awakening intersect with his religious awakening?
It's funny, we refer to this period of when he was, as Remnick said in the beginning, so divisive. And I'm wondering whether we ought to flip that on its end, and it's maybe we're divisive. He chose not to accept induction into the United States Army. It was a faith-based, spiritual, religious decision. But because this was a Black man in America in the mid-1960s, no one could take it as that. It was as if he was giving a political middle finger to America. And so the book had to be thrown at him. The maximum sentence had to be given to him. And I think, very strangely enough, in the paradoxical ways of the universe, it then turned him into a political figure in a much more dimensional way. In order to survive, they were dipping into Rasheda's mom's college fund in order to survive, and he went out on the road giving lectures. And where he went out on the road were to Black communities, to other Nation of Islam temples, to universities, to historically Black colleges, but also universities all around the country. And this is at a time when the vast number of young people are beginning to switch from the kind of blind sense that whatever my government does is right, to a sense that the Vietnam War was a big mistake. And so he becomes a political figure. He's already been made a political lightning rod, but his is coming from, I think, this deep well of aspiration that Rasheda articulated just now so beautifully. And then, of course, from this deep spiritual belief, a part of a very complicated and not always positive journey that he's on. And in this case, they come together, and with the refusal of the draft, it turns him into a huge symbol. Many people revile him for this, but those same people, I suppose, Rasheda and I were talking about this the other day, there are a few unreconstructed brethren who might still hold a grudge, but most of the billions of people in the world have already let go of all of that and saw that A, he was right about that war, that B, he had taken a courageous stand based on principle, and he had lived through that. As he said, I'd rather face machine gun fire today than go against the teachings of my religion. That has an incendiary effect for people, and it was galvanic at the time.
It's interesting in the film, you really get the sense of how the Nation of Islam became so much a part of his life, not just his faith. Members of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad's son becomes his manager. And it cost him a lot. It cost him his friendship with Malcolm X. It cost him parts of his career. It cost him personal friends. Rashida, I don't know if you know the answer to this, or you might have some insight into it. What was it about this association and this deep belief that led him to be okay with losing a lot?
You know, early on, we knew my dad was seeking something, especially at a time he was devastated with Emmett Till's horrific death. And so at that time, I think my dad felt that he really, really needed to do something to help his people. Now, he had this Louisville group that were, all white businessmen who were protecting him from the mob. And, at first my dad, as Ken so eloquently mentioned, that the way, and David McMahon and also Sarah, the way they put the story together was that, my dad was at first really shy about really talking about, things like religion and race, because, he had this, Louisville group that was protecting him. And so he wanted to be very careful about, and at first he kind of was like, oh, I don't really want to talk about race and religion. I really don't want to, open up that can of worms. And then, when Emmett Till tragically died, and the way he died, my dad kind of really had a resurgence of thought, thinking, no, I have to do something about this, because Black and brown people are being killed. It could have been me. I'm the same age as Emmett Till. And so I think that was kind of a turning point for him to start to feel like he needed to do something. And the Nation, he was kind of flirting with the Nation kind of on and off. As Cassius Clay, he was kind of attracted to this voice of pride, and it had transformative power, because for the first time he's hearing a imam speak about loving oneself and Black pride, and they said great things about owning your own businesses and not going into neighborhoods where you're not wanted. And so that was attractive to my dad. And so he definitely was, full throttle involved with the Nation's message. Not all of the message was attractive to my dad, but the message of Black pride and power and owning your own businesses and those positive aspects my dad really was attracted to. And, my grandfather, my mom's dad, he was one of the lieutenants for the Nation. So at that point, my mom was in the Nation, my grandparents were in the Nation. So, and that's where he met my mom. Obviously, he loved just the way the women were treated. They were covered, they were respectful. The men had control and power, and they were confident. And so he really, really loved that. Unfortunately, Malcolm X came on board. He was already in love with Islam before Malcolm came on board. But when Malcolm became a friend, he was like, okay, this is a great friend. And he really felt like that was his brother. And he continued to treat him as his brother. And when, the Nation started to manipulate him and saw that, hey, I have this mouthpiece for this religion. Muhammad can take this religion all over the world. Let me be the one to change his name. So they wanted him all to themselves. And so it did cost him, Papa Cash wasn't really happy with the Nation. Papa Cash mentioned many times that, you're going to die broke with these people because they were just robbing him on all angles. And they were, and they were taking full advantage. But the power that my dad, and it wasn't about him leaving his brother aside, casting his brother aside, because he still thought Malcolm was his brother. He still loved Malcolm. That's what people don't realize. My dad always felt Malcolm. And Malcolm tried to contact my dad, and then he had the Nation people that's screening, Malcolm's calls. But he still deeply loved Malcolm, still considered Malcolm a friend and a brother. But he put his religion first. And we have to realize, and he sacrificed a lot for the sake of his religion. He left his first wife, Sanji, because she wasn't following his religion. So we have to put things into perspective when you think about, what my dad was willing to sacrifice for his religious beliefs. That included his close brother, Malcolm X, and his first wife, Sanji. He did a lot of things in the name. He said he, faced gunfire for that day. He even said he hated boxing because his religion was first in his life. And of course, later on, we start to see that, finally, we start to see true Islam through Warith Deen Muhammad, who brought true Islam to African Americans in North America.
It's interesting watching this doc right now, Ken, because it's been 5 years since Muhammad Ali's death, but it's also 5 years ago this month that Colin Kaepernick took a knee for the first time. And we know what's happened to him. He hasn't played professional football since. Just pulling out a little bit, what has and hasn't changed about athletes who take a stand on their beliefs?
Well, I think we're in an age in which we're seeing a lot more activism on the part of athletes, and I think they stand on the shoulders of Muhammad Ali and before him, Jackie Robinson, obviously others. Colin Kaepernick has really lost a lot, but he still has a Nike contract. It's a little bit different than dipping into your wife's college fund in order to just survive and pay the rent. So Muhammad Ali was the one who risked everything. Obviously, there are other heroes from that period, Smith and Carlos from the Mexico City Olympics raising the fists. They were disappeared. Curt Flood in baseball challenged the plantation system of the reserve clause, which enslaved not only black players but white players as well, and he was disappeared. And two white guys would have to, Messerschmitt and McNally, would have to sort of make that change. We do have that kind of example, but today we have a whole range of athletes who speak out, particularly vocally. And I think they stand on the shoulders of Muhammad Ali because nothing in front of them or currently or ahead of them looks anything like the kind of courage that Muhammad Ali exhibited, not just in the ring, and all of the issues that he was dealing with and addressing, and part of about the role of sports in society and the black athlete in particular, and ideas of black masculinity and manhood and civil rights, and what sort of context that was in, and politics and race and religion and war, all of these sex, all of these things are part of it. Towards the very end of the film, Howard Bryant, the great writer, is talking. We cut away to a demonstration on the Brooklyn Bridge. We don't tell you what it is. People are wearing masks, so we know the time frame is now. And it zooms in on a young woman who has gone to this demonstration wearing a simple black T-shirt with the white letters that say Muhammad Ali. For her, all she needed to represent, in every sense of that word, at that demonstration was this man's name that had come to symbolize freedom, and not just for himself, but for all people, and courage, and not just in the ring, and love. And that's the most difficult thing that we have to address and talk about in our film. And I think about it because the word is so difficult to say and speak and parse, and thank goodness we had a secret weapon in Rasheda, who is able to reflect back at us the extraordinary love that her father had and that she herself has. And I think we were able to feel as viewers, I certainly know as filmmakers, Sarah and Dave and I, more comfortable in diving deeply into this idea. You don't go from reviled to the most beloved person on your planet unless you've actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And we know he's a good talker. He's one of the best talkers ever. But I think we tend to forget in the opacity that iconography bestows on people, that he actually walked the walk, and he did it magnificently, and transcends his sport. He's the greatest athlete of the 20th century, maybe of all time, but he's also one of the greatest Americans of all time, and there is still much we can get from him, much that he has to share and give and bestow on us.
Rasheda, it's interesting to hear Ken talk to you about you as a secret weapon, because as I was watching the film, it's not hagiography. It talks about your dad's flaws. It talks about infidelity. It talks about some of the cruel language he used. For you to be a part of this, what made you say yes to the film, knowing that it was going to be comprehensive in a way that might be uncomfortable sometimes?
Well, when Sarah reached out to me, it was, I believe it was 5 years into the production process, and she was starting to gather some speakers for, and it was kind of early on in trying to, get some of the members from my dad's life. And, when she sent me an email, it was back in 2018, she had said something that kind of something went off in my head, was like, ding, that's interesting. Sarah had mentioned, I wanted to do a comprehensive look. And I've seen so many documentaries on my dad. I was just like, I can't see anymore. It's just too much out there. And this was just another request to me when Sarah reached out. I was like, oh, this is another documentary on Daddy. And but when she said it was a comprehensive look into your father as the Muslim, and she had that first, and I was like, oh, okay. And then, as a humanitarian, as an ambassador of peace, as a poet, as a brother, as a father, as a, and I said, wow, this is going to be interesting, because now you're talking about my dad's life, but his whole life. It's not just this decade of his boxing career or this part of his political, insurgence. It's his whole life. And I was really attracted to the whole life, because most people don't get a chance to see my dad vulnerable as a father, still in the cornflakes. When I saw the first, I was able to watch first, all 4 parts. And when they decided to open up with May, my sister, and the cornflakes, I was just like, started crying, because I was like, that's Daddy. That's who he was as a father. Mm-hmm. He was so fun and exciting, and he played games with us and magic tricks, and it all started coming back to me as great memories. And so I was really happy that Sarah and David and Ken, they decided to put that as the opening, because that was the dad. That was not the big figure, not the icon, not the famous man. That was just the dad. And I just thought that was just very well stated in the first part of this, and I knew I was going to love it from that point on.
So, but we do have to talk about boxing a little bit. Can we talk about the boxing a little bit, Ken?
No. It's the collected works of William Shakespeare is what I call those, the top 5 matches that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the line is the beauty and the brutality of boxing. Yeah. And I was wondering, as you're thinking about putting this together, and you're making your scripts and you're going through your drafts and going through your edits, what were the conversations about in terms of the balance of how much boxing to put in to the film?
I think it's an important thing. We don't in PBS, I'm so happy to say, have the focus groups and worry about the marketing dimensions of it in that way. We knew ourselves how to calibrate. But, in the course of doing this is not an additive process, it's subtractive. We had hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage of this man talking and acting and being in boxing matches. And so we knew that there were signal ones. There were a few we wanted to do lengthy examinations of, another sort of second tier of ones we wanted to do a little bit. Others could just be mentioned in a still photograph or a frame of that. So we were constantly calibrating that throughout the editing process. But I early on I was helping rewrite the introduction, in which I wanted to point out that this sport is called the sweet science, which is both brutal, and I think for most people it is brutal and not attractive, and it does have spectacular artistic aspects to it, and that this is the greatest practitioner of that. So while this is a difficult amount, it's still not enough to satisfy us about what he's doing that is so beautiful. The irony, of course, Alison, is that this profession of his, this wonderfully mythically acquired profession with the stolen bike and the meteoric rise and all of the ups and downs and the travails and missing 3.5 years at the height of his powers and coming back and winning the title, came with just an unbelievable price. An unbelievable price. That whatever was in the DNA of this family in terms of Parkinson's, and there's other instances of it, somehow these blows sponsored and promoted it in a way, we can only assume, that then made this most valuable of human beings silent for most of the last 3 decades of his life. But it was a silence that spoke volumes. He did not stop. He kept going. And, when he was loud and rambunctious, he could hold a press conference and a good part of the sports world would stop and pay attention. When he was silent and visited a country, the whole country would come to a stop. And I think that we don't fully appreciate, and one of the things we asked Rasheda to do in our interview, in Sarah's interview with her, is to help us understand that post-boxing, Parkinson's human being. Michael J. Fox, the actor, said an amazing thing, also has Parkinson's, that struck me for decades. He said it decades ago. He said, I couldn't be still until I couldn't be still. And in a way, Muhammad Ali, this great talker, couldn't really talk until he couldn't talk. And then what he gave the rest of the planet transcended the kind of spoken words. We still love to watch that beautiful man. He is pretty. He is gorgeous. I think if Michelangelo was, asked to sculpt David today, he'd go, well, I actually have a better model in mind. And he might think as the epitome of the perfect human form, Muhammad Ali, and he would not be wrong. And he was funny, and he was valuable, and he spouted poetry, and he was irresistible. And yet, that's not the whole story. And it's important to if we're going to give him the label you did at the very front, Alison, of icon, then somehow we have to find ways in which he's accessible, that we build the kind of stairways to his greatness that allow us access not only to these great strengths, but to the weaknesses that, to her credit, Rasheda, of course, had to, it was hard, but it was true. And I think she recognized, and her daddy, as she says, and it melts me every time she says that word, daddy, her daddy taught her that the truth was the most important thing.
The 4-part series, Muhammad Ali, the documentary, will stream on PBS platforms until, I believe it is, October 9th. Ken Burns and Rasheda Ali, thank you for spending so much time with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me.
While we're on a break, we encourage you to network with other attendees and visit our Expo booths. To participate, select the networking icon located on the left-hand side of the screen. Next, click Join, and you'll be randomly paired with another attendee for about 5 minutes. If you wish, you can exchange virtual information with each other and keep in contact via direct message within the platform. You can also click the Explore icon to visit our virtual Expo booths. Here you can explore more resources from the Atlantic and our underwriters related to today's event. We'll see you shortly after the break.